You might leave one of those open if people are still straggling in here from the big traffic jam. Good morning, everyone. I'm Matthew Schwonek, and sometimes aren't we all? I'm here to initiate you into the next phase, the next step of your academic program, the Warfare Studies course. And in this vein, I would like you to turn to the painting depicted on screen here. This is Diego Velázquez's masterpiece, the Surrender of Breda. One of the great pieces of Western art. It depicts the fall of that city in the year 1624 during the 80 Years' War. It is a masterpiece of verisimilitude, I think. It is also something like a mirror that is shined onto our appreciation of war, the way that we understand the problem of war. At the very forefront, the center of the action is the Genero, Ambrogio Spinola, receiving the surrender of his Dutch counterparts. He's the center of the action. A little bit of light sort of peers through to shine on him and some of his lieutenants. But he's the focus of the action, the genius that brought all of this together. The instruments of war are on display everywhere, the tools that Spinola used. They're grim, terrifying, but also impersonal, with the exception of this lone musketeer who's sort of looking at you saying, ironic, isn't it? Far beyond, in the distance, immovable, physical, yet somehow abstract, is the prize, the fortress of Breda. It is that physical thing, that political object that has been rendered physical through Spinola's genius. What's interesting about this even more is the painter's art, how Velázquez actually captured with some accuracy the scene here. Of course, he sort of drew lines on the horizon, put a grid over the painting so that he could take it apart piece by piece. And this gets me to thinking about how we study war. This is very much how we do it. We'll fix a point on the horizon, politics, and then we'll put a grid on it and take it apart and look at each piece and try to assay their relationship and understand how they fit together. And those of you who've perused the syllabus and some of the lessons before coming here this morning know that that is no idle jest. That is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take war apart and look at its pieces, try to see how they fit together and understand what makes it go, what makes it tick. We're going to look at the nature of war, the field of military theory. We'll look at the operational use of war, the range of operations. We'll take a look at traditional and alternative forms of warfare, as well as theory and practice as it relates to contemporary challenges. It's worth pointing out to you the objectives that have been levied here on us. Not only lay out fairly well a broad investigation of war, but they also set it at a very high level. We're called on to analyze and apply. This is a course about ideas, and it's a course about thinking about war, not about background data, neat facts about the spindle tree axle in the Battle of Oudenarde. We like to think of it as the short course on the theory of war, an appreciation of the ideas, the big ideas about war. Now, this is a fairly narrow interpretation of this area. My colleagues at civilian schools at SAMS, SAS, SAWS, and the like, they take a very broad view. They think about the origins of war. They look at war as a social phenomenon. They look at gender issues, all very interesting and all very important, but those are not in my objectives. And with only 15 days, 15 class periods to cover all the big ideas, it's necessary, I think, to take a narrow view and look at those that are most relevant to military practitioners. And after all, I'm looking at an auditorium full of military men. And I don't think you'll complain about that. And if you do, well, I'll be happy to hear all of those afterward. Before we break and I deliver it to the hands of my colleagues, what I'd like to do is run through some essential terms and map out the subject area so that can save them some time. And I'll start with the problem of war. It seems obvious that we should all know what war is, although I don't think that is so obvious. Across various cultures, across various times, war has meant different things to different people. Going back to antiquity, the Roman statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero said, war is a contention by force. It's a conflictual relationship, sort of like that he shared with Mark Antony, in which Mark Antony's men murdered Cicero, cut off his hands, cut out his tongue, and nailed him to the Senate door. Others, like the early modern jurist Hugo Grotius, suggested that war is a state of affairs, a legal state. And so the lawyers tell us it is a legal state, and who's to argue with them? Others, a great many people, suggest that war is sort of a dread disease. The author of The Little Prince, Antoine Saint-Exupéry, said it's like typhus. He should know the Second World War killed him just as surely as typhus would have. A political scientist, Hedley Bull, in his book The Anarchical Society, had a more prosaic definition. He suggested it's organized violence carried on by political units against each other. It doesn't have the cachet of the definitions of these literary men, but having come out of a course on politics only a few days ago, it makes a great deal of sense. And it's one that we've used here quite frequently, and it works for us. So as the course is underway, if you feel like you're losing the thread, think to yourself, organized violence by political units against each other. That's what we're focusing on. Theory, on the other hand, is a little stickier than war. Especially for Americans, we tend to think of theory as airy-fairy nonsense, like Schrodinger's cat, the hypotheses involved with that. Or alternately, we think of it as idle speculation. Whenever Detective Columbo was pissing in the wind, he'd say, I got a theory. I'd like to suggest that theory is something harder than that. It is much more valuable. It's systematically developed assumptions, principles, ideas that explain behaviors, phenomena, and the like. War theory are ideas that help explain and offers insight into the fundamental problem of war, as well as the conduct of operations. It has been valued in many fields. Doctors value it to train the mind of the surgeon. Lawyers value it to train the mind of the barrister. And in military education, we value it because of its ability to train the mind of the commander, to sharpen his wits. And it does this by illuminating sort of the normal patterns of war, and by extension giving us some tools and the ability to see when war steps outside of the normal pattern and gives us some assistance here. It's important to keep in mind that theory is, it's thinking, it's reflection, it's judgment, it's not doing. You read Sun Tzu last night, and I think you understand what I mean here. If you get past the birds fly south before the first snow, or the soldier who camps downstream from latrines gets stomachache, you realize in here is a comprehensive, even transcendent way of thinking about war that puts emphasis on the objective as opposed to destruction, that highlights psychological manipulation over brute force, and more. Of course, there's nothing wrong with a manual for action, and we have plenty of that for you. We have 3 courses on doctrine and doctrinal questions offered by my friends and colleagues in DEW. We all, I think, have a pretty good understanding of doctrine, what it is. It's sort of best practices codified and embraced by an organization. These are well thought through. Doctrine comes from doctrina, the Latin meaning learning. My old high school motto was in sanctitate et doctrina, in holiness and learning. If the order of Franciscan monks found out what mockery we made of those words, they'd hang their heads in shame. But an idea of church doctrine is actually quite useful here. It's authoritative. Just as military doctrine is authoritative, you're supposed to follow the doctrine in the pinch. It is very important in a dangerous and uncertain realm like military affairs. Soldiers need to know that they have the best ideas at hand and that everybody is working on the same principles. For our purposes in this course, it's interesting to entertain the question of what's the relationship of theory to doctrine. We suggest that doctrine flows from theory, and a good grounding in theory helps you apply doctrine effectively. You could probably try to parse this out too far, doctrine and theory, and it really won't get you very far. There is no hard and fixed line, and it's best to focus on what you're really after as opposed to labels. In fact, we're going to spend more time actually talking about strategy in this course as opposed to doctrine. And I would say this even though this isn't a strategy course per se. Anyway, any person who looks at the bigger questions of war is ultimately drawn to questions of strategy, and it's impossible to keep them out, so we might as well embrace it fully. Strategy, of course, is the art of the general. It's what generals do. It's the development of interests and objectives and the synchronization of resources and means to afford possibilities and support for policy to increase probabilities of success. It's a process that in some of the writings of our friends from Army Command and Staff College, it's a process that links ends, ways, and means all together. It's a consideration of all of these 3, so you can't leave anyone out in terms of strategy. One of the key features of strategy is its size. It is a huge domain, and you get a sense of that already. We've talked about grand strategy or national security strategy, which develops interests and identifies interests for 300 million people and orchestrates diplomatic, economic, military, and informational instruments. We distinguish military strategy or defense strategy from that, and that focuses on purely military issues insofar as that is possible, and it in a way competes with economic and informational strategies. We even distinguish theater strategy from military and defense strategy, courses of action and strategies that develop objectives and interests in a certain region. National objectives as well as coalition objectives, and or coordinates resources for this. Strategy wasn't always this big. In fact, before 1800, it was really quite a small realm. The space for war and strategy was quite limited. Supreme political and military decision-making powers tended to be concentrated in the hands of one man. And more often than not, that man took the army into the field himself, so that it was a simple, easy step from strategy to tactics. But since then, the world has gotten awfully big and awfully complicated. And in fact, we have had to insert another level of war between strategy and tactics. And that's the operational level, the operational art, the necessity to create something that would reintegrate war when it threatened to become totally incoherent. Emerged really after the First World War, and in fact the term operational art comes from was coined in the 20s on the basis of the German operative and the Soviet operatika, and the Russians more than anyone else mapped out this area, and we borrow heavily from them. Operational arts officially is the employment of forces to attain strategic objectives through design, organization, integration, conduct of campaigns. It translates the JFC strategy into design and tactical action. It's a bridge between the strategic realm and the tactical execution. We usually associate the operational level, the operational art, with a campaign, stitching together a series of battles to attain an intermediate objective. But it's actually more than this. It unites the fighting front with the deep rear. It integrates logistics, command arrangements, organization, even training. And it is a fairly big and important area. Now, we're not going to say much at all about tactics or combat. But it is, I think, important to offer a caution here. Combat, the purposeful use of violence to impose some sort of ascendancy is ever present in war. It's in the very nature of war. We have gotten into a bad habit, particularly analysts and scholars. We've gotten in a habit of taking out the blood and the injury from our discussions, and in the process, we fail to see something very important. Injury and destruction is in the very nature of war. It's how war works. And if you don't understand that, if you leave it out, you're missing something very important. In fact, it took a professor of English to remind us that we shouldn't be using these euphemistic constructions about taking them down, going downtown, neutralizing them. Think about the way people use that terminology instead of saying what they really mean. This is an awfully corrosive and dispiriting way of talking about war. And I was reminded of this not long ago when I encountered a piece of verse by the great poet of air warfare, Randall Jarrell. And he wrote about the Second World War, young men flying off in planes named for women, bombing cities that they learned about in school. When they're used up, their bodies thrown on the ash heap of European cities, and they're passing marked only with the bureaucratic phrases, well, mistakes were made, or our casualties were low. What a terrible way to talk about war. A subject that we're going to spend a good bit of time directly addressing is civil-military relations. By this we mean the relationship between a society and its armed forces, the interface between the governments and the commanders, how it's regulated and how it's ordered. A part of this is civilian control of the military, the extent to which civilian leaders can impose their authority on their military servants. We're particularly interested in the interface between top commanders and their civilian masters, theater commanders and their civilian representatives. In our thinking about war, which is colored by an appreciation of politics, Civil-military relations has profound implications. Karl von Clausewitz, a German writer, had some very radical things to say about politics and war and civil-military relations. He suggested that no major proposal can be worked out in ignorance of political factors, which means that civilian leaders can rightly insert themselves in various decisions extending all the way down to the operational level of war, and that this is well and good. Of course, as you all well know from reading the headlines, this interface between civilian and military isn't perfectly worked out, and it's constantly being renegotiated, causing a lot of heartache and pain for every new commander, every new chief executive. Another topic we're obliged to cover is war termination. The process by which wars, hostilities, and fighting are brought to an end. It's usually marked by complex bargaining over ends and means. Wars, hopefully, end with an armistice or a peace treaty that locks in the objectives that the parties sought at the outset and guarantee something better than you had before. War termination isn't something that magically happens. You win a victory and then you're called home and then there's a victory parade. In fact, it requires a good deal of planning, and it has to be incorporated into strategy and the operational art. The history is replete with victories which came to nothing because commanders and civilian leaders failed to contemplate how they're going to get the opponent to surrender or bargain with them. The U.S. came face to face with this dilemma in the Gulf in 1991, when after a stupendous victory, everybody seemed more intent on planning the victory parade rather than trying to figure out how they're going to get Saddam Hussein to sign a peace treaty, with the result being that we got 10 years of undeclared war. In the 1990s, civilian and military leaders came to understand that there are a host of military operations that support the transition to peace, and military has a role to play there. No less a paragon of military virtue than William Tecumseh Sherman suggested that we need to keep our eyes on the peace that follows, not so much the destruction at hand, for the legitimate object of war is a more perfect peace, and joint doctrine commands that we consider termination in education, strategy, and plans. Now, let me tell you a little bit how this course is organized. You all should think back to that television show, Seinfeld, and the episode, The Muffin Tops, which featured the real J. Peterman reality tour. You ought to think of this course as organized much like the real J. Peterman reality tour. You know, every morning at 9 o'clock, I'm going to get you on the bus here. We're going to drive around, and I'm going to stop, kick you out. My instructors are going to show you around. It could be a garbage dump. It could be Newman's postal routes. But afterward, you're going to come back on the bus, and we're going to move on to the next destination. Now, the real J. Peterman reality tour was guided by, one really odd man's stream of consciousness. This one has some more rigorous principles guiding it, although that's open to question, some people would say. I really have three ideas, three themes that organize this material, and I think make it hang together. First is the primacy of politics. Keep this in mind as you go through the course. Politics, we understand what that is. It's the way that groups make decisions. It generally applies to behavior in a civil state. It's social relations regarding power and wealth and regulation within a political unit. Politics, according to a very old intellectual tradition, is the dominant field. War is the subordinate field. In fact, some, like Karl von Clausewitz, suggest that war is nothing but a simple extension of politics, and it is impossible to think about a separate technical field of warfare that is distinct from politics and has its own principles. This has enormous implications for the conduct of war. Michael Howard, one of the leading critics of our day, has suggested that, frankly, military victories themselves do not determine outcomes of wars. They merely create political conditions which political leaders might or might not be able to seize upon. And actually, I think that's very helpful, especially if you're thinking about planning and operations. It gives you a sense of what you're trying to do with this. It's interesting to consider any number of questions regarding the primacy of politics. Here we are in an age when the state seems to be losing its power. It's being attacked by all sorts of other formations. There's Al-Qaeda and the Taliban out there trying to elevate culture over rational interest. Even Americans talk about the culture war and we got to get rid of our internal enemies. And you need to ask yourself, is the sway, the power of this rational political appreciation for war diminishing? And what does that mean for how we think about war now and in the future? Another theme is the pursuit of decision by battle. This has been one of the dominant ideas in military thought and doctrine strategy going back to the 17 or 1600s. It's the holy grail to win a battle of annihilation and dictate upon your opponent the most far-reaching terms. Battle is, combat between two or more, which aims at or is restricted in time, space, and by objectives. We tend to think of battle as synonymous with war. Winston Churchill said, battles are the milestones of modern secular history. Those of you in this room are apt to think like Frederick the Great, that war is decided only by battles and it's not finished except by them. But I should point out to you that battle is only one creative use of violence in war. There are so many more. There's raids, sieges, blockade, military occupation, insurgency, massacre. The most common use of military force in human history is mass murder and massacre, not battle. Battle is only the way that we roll, the way we like to wage war. Our European ancestors did pretty good with battle, and on this basis they were able to impose their supremacy, hegemony on just about all of the known and unknown world. We Americans studied at their feet in 2 world wars and got really good at seeking decision by battle and provoking great battles. The problem with this is that just about everyone else has had a really good look at our playbook. And they understand that by not accommodating us and not giving us a battle, they can impose political costs. So it gets harder and harder to produce a decision by battle or even a battle at all. And we might honestly ask ourselves whether our preferred way of fighting war, seeking a decision by battle, is facing ever diminishing returns. And we might need to chuck it out in favor of something else. Finally, a study of war, big ideas or the small ones, is apt to be a study of change over time. Since the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991, a concept called the revolution in military affairs has come to dominate the debate over military change. And a revolution in military affairs is defined as a sort of discontinuous increase in capabilities, or better yet, effectiveness. And it comes from not just a single driver, but multiple sources. It can be political, social, economic transformation. Think of industrialization and what that did for war in the 19th century. It can also come from technological developments, information technologies, and the like. We're talking here really big change, not Tang or Kevlar, but the French Revolution giving rise to Napoleon, the Blitzkrieg, which gives us modern mechanized warfare, and the union of the ICBM and atomic fission, which gives us the ability to destroy entire nations in hours, if not minutes. The drivers of change are important. The technologies, the underpinnings of it are important. But in this course, we're mostly concerned with the ideas that go with change. To have some sort of new development, new gadget, new gizmo, or a new environment or organizational system, for that to be valuable and for you to get that discontinuous jump in capability and effectiveness, ideas are required that integrate it into war and make it useful. And we're going to focus mostly on the ideas that come out of steam power and mechanized warfare. We also ought to ask ourselves some questions regarding change, and I can, almost guess the one that's on everybody's mind here. We live in an age of great turbulence and great change. Political organizations are changing. Social norms are going by the boards. Are we in an era of great change? And will we see our ideas about, mechanized and joint combined warfare chucked out in favor of something new that we'll have to create, cobbled together from the ideas, the few ideas that we have? Now, what I owe you as the course director is a coherent syllabus. A syllabus does many things. It takes the ideas I've described here, puts them into lessons, assignments, reading list, and a schedule. For this course, I've taken the topics I've outlined here, broken them into 30 lessons, and further broken them into 3 5-day phases. The lessons are ordered chronologically. That's because humans think chronologically. We start in phase 1, which is sort of a down and dirty look at the essentials of modern theory. We ease in with the ancients, but pretty quick we jump to Napoleon and then move on to the American way of war before talking about civil-military relations. From here, we move to a phase that considers those big changes that I mentioned before and which shape our current ideas about combined and joint operations. We'll talk about ideas, theories of sea warfare and maritime strategy, air warfare, mechanized warfare, and we'll put a lid on warfare with early nuclear strategy and early nuclear theory, the foundations of nuclear theory, probably the most challenging area in military theory and the focus of most attention really since the Second World War. At least the brightest minds have gone in that direction. Phase 3 is a grab bag that takes a look at a bunch of things that are going concerns for the military professional. We'll take a look at insurgency, unconventional warfare, stability operations. These are absolutely important. We can't ignore them. They're parts of the problem of war. At the same time, they sort of challenge our conventional ideas about major operations and the pursuit of battle and combined and joint operations. We're going to end the course by taking a look at the moral and ethical dimensions of war, and I can think of no better way to try and pull all these strands together and reassemble this picture and try to determine whether or not it's greater than the sum of its parts. Now, when I was in college, it wasn't just the list of lessons that really told you what the course was about. It wasn't the boilerplate course description. The objectives, it was the reading list. That told you what was going on. And we've got a reading list for you. Have we got a reading list for you? Here are our issued books, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz. We got books on logistics, American strategy, civil military relations, sea warfare, air warfare, mechanized warfare, and more. And missile warfare, the nuclear warfare, counterinsurgency, and the like. There is a reason that we do it this way. Since the time that books were invented, they have been the premier means of explaining complicated ideas. And in this course, we are after very complicated ideas. You're all wearing the uniforms of your nation's services. You might have thought of yourselves as comptrollers or logisticians before, but you're now all warriors, and we're obliged to give you some very tough and challenging ideas. There's no way around it. There's no way to simplify this. There are no tweets, no bullet papers that can substitute here. Anybody who tells you that is a chimp. Just to show that there's no hard feelings, we've inserted a film in the course, though, at the end of phase 2. It is, however, a very soul-crushing, boring, heavy film. You'll like it a lot. As the course is underway, you will be obliged to complete 2 short essays. Some educators like to use really big, beefy midterms. Some like the really big, gut-busting final. One instrument that optimally sends a couple of people to the hospital. I like a couple of short papers. It allows me to test more, and it makes it possible to test, when I use a small number of instruments, I find myself coming up with cockamamie questions like, write a unified field theory of politics and war in 7 to 10 pages. Small papers allow me to ask more manageable questions. We've tied these to the day's readings, capped them at 2 pages, no more than 2 pages, and they're weighted at 20%. I don't want any of you Poindexters to spaz out during the course, so, we have high expectations, but I don't want to send anyone to the hospital or divorce court. We do have a final. We got to have a final. All the courses have a final. It's like the other finals. It's comprehensive. It's on the last day. Not as comprehensive as some of the others. We'll give you 3 questions. You pick one. You've got to answer it in 5 pages. It goes out on the last day of the classes. 2 days later, you turn it in. It will be returned on the 15th of January. At least that's what the schedule says right now. And we'll give you enough time to sort your thoughts out, wordsmith 5 pages and get it into us. Plenty of time to complete it and get the thing done and put it behind you. As for the question, well, you didn't think I was going to give it to you. My job is to keep everything opaque, to treat you like mushrooms, to keep you in the dark and feed you crap. That's what you guys think, so I might as well say it, even though it's not true. Oh, we're going to grade you on class participation as well, 10%. So be chipper and be alert in class. Look out for that cold call. Our schedule is pretty light at the start. We're only meeting once a week for the first 2 weeks of the course. We got the sports day there, but pretty soon we get into our Monday, Thursday rhythm in October, at the end of October, start of November. November is a really tough month. You guys got a lot to do. You need to get your time management skills squared away real fast. A lot of assignments are due that time. You got to work on your elective papers. There are some days off in here. Polish Independence Day falls on a Sunday, so it'll be observed on the 12th. We've got Thanksgiving Day and an AETC Family Day at the end there on Friday. Sorry, DOD civilians, you ain't part of the family. But don't count on these. You can't, over-rely on these days off. You need to get squared away and get yourself sorted out. One admin note, I'm going to go TDY in the middle of November, and while I'm away, my brother Raul is going to run the course. December gives us one big push, and we're over the hump. We hand out the exam. You got Mary Todd Lincoln Day to work on it. It's free and clear. Hand it in. A little bit more agony, and then we all break for the holiday. And I've already got, visions of the slag heaps of Cleveland, covered in soot-blackened snow, and those little urchins running around for that muck in the streets and the rock salt rotting out the bottom of my car in my mind. I'm just homesick. Maybe just sick. There is a hiccup in the schedule. The Honorable Ike Skeleton is coming down on the 5th of November to receive an honorary degree. No man deserves it more than Ike. Military education has had no better friend than he since the day of General Emory Upton. We're all going to be out there in Polifica Auditorium. You'll see us all in our best duds. They'll be speechifying, they'll be crying, and there'll be all sorts of grand things. But remember, we are but warriors for the working day, and we are obliged to offer a full range of classes that day. So we're going to back things up about an hour and a half, but I promise to get everybody out of here by 16:30. Not you faculty fellows, but you guys at least will get out by 16:30. Administratively, lesson plans, syllabus, they're all on Blackboard. Refer to them there. We're also going to respond to lecturers' questions using our discussion board. So if you have a question that a lecturer wasn't able to answer, post it there, and we'll see to it that one of our operators manages to get you a response in a timely fashion. It's a good system. We're, though, still learning how to make the best use of it. If you have any suggestions, positive ones, please let us know. If you have any issues, let us know, and we'll sort it out. If you have questions, concerns, please feel free to come and talk to me. I'm willing to entertain the most harebrained ideas, the most pettifogging complaints. If you want to scream obscenities at me, that's what my father used to do. On the other hand, you might think of speaking nicely to my deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Jeannot Boucher of the Royal Canadian Air Force. We might have burned York, Ontario in 1813, but the Canadians have had our back since 1979, and I for one, am personally grateful for this, even though they may have some odd ideas about health care. Butch is a very fine representative of the Canadian service. I was going to say a UH-1 pilot, but it's actually a CH-1 he's the pilot of, and some Afghan experience, and I rely on him for insight into the real world. And I find that he has the unerring teaching instincts. And so for all intents and purposes, when you speak to the deputy course director, you're speaking to the course director, in my mind. All right, that's the Warfare Studies course for 2013. It's the short course in military theory, especially designed for military professionals. We're going to look at the major trends in military thought from Napoleon to New Dawn. We're going to read books, we're going to discuss them, we're going to write about them. Anything else I need to say before? One thing, for the rest of your careers, you're going to get all sorts of briefings and slideshows without end. But you're only going to have 15 days to talk with some pretty talented academic professionals and some very accomplished military men with a lot of experience about the big questions regarding war and the profession of arms. We're going to test you, we're going to poke you and prod you, we're going to rack you and stack you, and that's just the way it is. But any importance this course has is what you give it. And so you need to act accordingly. And so with that, I say to you, go forward, Sun Tzu is waiting.